Jacob had always been a quiet man. His demeanor wasn't the kind to demand attention. It seeped into the room like a shadow, unnoticed until it was too late. He had married Mia 5 years ago, swearing that they would grow old together, cherishing every moment. But lately, something about their bond had shifted. The once passionate love had turned into lukewarm exchanges, and Mia had become distant. At first, Jacob dismissed it. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she had stress from work. That was until he found the phone. Hidden under the couch, the glowing screen beckoned him with the very thing he feared most: a message. Not just any message, but one from a man named Daniel, filled with words that oozed affection and promises. Jacob's heart dropped into a bottomless pit, and for the first time in his life, the quiet man felt something dangerous stir inside him. He didn't confront her, not yet. He wasn't stupid or impulsive. No, Jacob was the kind of man who played the long game. Patience was his ally, and he intended to make full use of it. A confrontation could be premature. He needed to know how deep her betrayal ran, how far she had gone. For weeks, Jacob started watching her, not in the obvious way that would trigger alarms, but in subtle, invisible strokes of observation. He studied her habits, listened carefully to her phone calls, and even installed a small hidden camera in their bedroom. He became the ghost in his own house, a lurking presence who gathered every piece of evidence he needed. Every giggle, every whispered word, every message left behind. They were all daggers to his heart. He followed her when she said she had a girls' night. He knew the truth now. There was no girls' night. There was only Daniel. They met at a dingy hotel on the outskirts of town, a place so cheap and nondescript that it was designed to be forgotten. He watched them from his car, the window slightly down, the sharp scent of betrayal hanging in the air. But tonight would be different. Jacob sat alone in the darkness of their shared home, staring at the clock ticking away on the wall. Every second seemed like a hammer to his skull, pounding harder and harder. He felt his pulse quicken, his breath shallow. It was tonight. Mia had gone out again, giving him the same tired excuse, but he already knew. He had seen her pack the black lace lingerie earlier that day, something she hadn't worn for him in over a year. There was an eerie calmness to him as he moved through the house, setting things in place for what would soon unfold. The camera was already rolling in the bedroom, hidden in plain sight behind a picture frame. He adjusted the pillows on their bed, making everything appear normal, as if this was just another ordinary night. But this night was far from ordinary. He wasn't sure if it was rage that fueled him anymore. No, this was something deeper. A need for justice, for retribution. He wasn't just going to confront her. He wanted her to feel the weight of her betrayal. He wanted her to know that he had watched, that he had waited, that every moment she thought she had outwitted him, he had been there, lurking in the shadows, taking notes, preparing. As the clock struck midnight, the sound of the front door opening creaked through the house. He heard Mia's soft laughter, followed by a voice he had come to hate with every fiber of his being: Daniel. They thought they were clever, thought they were sneaking in unnoticed. Jacob's grip tightened around the cold steel of the revolver in his hand. He didn't need to follow them to the bedroom. He already knew the path they'd take. He stood in the darkened hallway, his back pressed against the wall, listening as the door to their bedroom clicked shut. He waited. Seconds passed like hours. He could hear the muffled sounds of their voices, their laughter, the intimacy that should have belonged to him but now belonged to this intruder. The pain in his chest was almost unbearable, a slow, burning fire that threatened to consume him. But still, he waited. Finally, when the moment was right, he stepped out of the shadows. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see them, his wife and her lover, wrapped in the sheets of their shared bed, completely unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the door. The rage that had been bubbling under the surface for weeks now threatened to boil over. His hand tightened on the revolver, his knuckles white with tension. But Jacob wasn't ready yet. He needed them to know. He needed them to feel the weight of what they had done before he delivered his final blow. Slowly, silently, he pushed the door open. The sound of the door creaking made Mia freeze, her eyes wide as she turned to see him standing there in the doorway. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Daniel, half-dressed, sat up, confusion and panic written all over his face. "Jacob?" Mia's voice trembled. She pulled the sheets up around her as if that could somehow protect her from the storm that was about to come. Jacob stepped forward, the revolver gleaming under the dim light of the bedroom. His eyes were locked on hers, cold and unforgiving. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of all the pain and betrayal he had endured. "Jacob, Mia stammered, her words failing her as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. Daniel, finally realizing the danger he was in, stood up, his hands raised. "Hey man, let's just—" "Shut up," Jacob snapped, his eyes flickering to Daniel for just a moment before returning to Mia. "This isn't about you. This is about her." The room was thick with tension, the kind that made the air hard to breathe. Mia's lips trembled as tears welled up in her eyes. She had never seen him like this before, so cold, so calculated. She had always thought of Jacob as the quiet, unassuming man. But this was something else entirely. This was a side of him she didn't recognize. Jacob took a step closer, his hand steady on the revolver. "How long?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Mia's throat tightened. It was a mistake," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Jacob laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that filled the room. "A mistake. How many mistakes, Mia? How many times did you bring him into our bed, into our life, while I stood here like an idiot trusting you?" Mia sobbed, her body trembling. "I'm sorry, Jacob. I'm so sorry. Please just—" "Sorry isn't enough." His voice was sharp, cutting through her apologies like a knife. "Do you even know what you've done to me? What you've taken from me?" Daniel took a cautious step forward. "Look, man, I didn't know." Before he could finish his sentence, Jacob's hand shot up, and the sound of the gunshot echoed through the room, deafening in its finality. Daniel collapsed to the floor, his eyes wide in shock as blood pooled around him. Mia screamed, her hands flying to her mouth as she backed away, her body shaking uncontrollably. Jacob didn't even flinch. He kept his eyes on Mia, watching as the horror of what had just happened washed over her. "Jacob, please," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't do this. I'll do anything, just don't." But Jacob was no longer listening. The rage that had been simmering for weeks had finally reached its breaking point, and there was no turning back now. Jacob stood over Daniel's lifeless body, his breathing slow and controlled, the revolver still smoking in his hand. The quiet man had finally broken his silence. It wasn't the gunshot that rang in his ears now. It was the scream. Mia's scream, raw and unfiltered, still echoed in the bedroom, but her voice faded into the background as he remained focused on her face, twisted in horror, drenched in guilt. Mia's back pressed against the bed's headboard as she shrank away from Jacob. She couldn't stop sobbing, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She wasn't crying just for Daniel. She was crying for herself. She knew Jacob, or at least she thought she did. She had never imagined him capable of this, of cold-blooded murder, and yet here he was, staring at her with those dead, unblinking eyes. "Please, please, Jacob." Mia's voice wavered as she begged, her words disjointed, drowned by her own fear. Jacob remained unmoved. "You think I won't pull this trigger again, Mia?" He pointed the gun toward her now, his voice icy and hollow. "Did you even hesitate? Did you think about me when you were with him? Did you think about us?" Mia shook her head frantically. "I made a mistake. Jacob, I didn't—" She couldn't find the words anymore. She had spent so long living her double life, convincing herself she could have both her husband and her lover, but now reality had crushed her. Jacob's lips curled into a cold smile. A mistake, Mia? This was never a mistake. This was a choice. You chose to betray me. You chose to lie. You thought I wouldn't see it, didn't you? You thought I wouldn't catch you. But I've been watching. Mia's eyes widened in disbelief. What? What do you mean you've been watching? Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapping the screen. In a matter of seconds, the tiny camera he had installed in their bedroom months ago flickered to life. The small screen filled with image after image of Mia and Daniel, captured in moments she thought were private, moments she had stolen from their marriage. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw herself exposed on the screen. Every secret, every betrayal caught on camera. She covered her face, ashamed, humiliated, but she couldn't look away from the harsh reality playing out before her. I've known for weeks, Jacob whispered. I watched every time you brought him here. I watched you lie to me, smile at me, kiss me, and then run off to him. Did you think I was stupid? Did you think I was blind? Mia's sobs grew louder. She couldn't process the depth of Jacob's pain, the meticulousness with which he had gathered this evidence. It wasn't just the fact that he had discovered the affair. It was how long he had known, how long he had waited, biding his time, letting her believe she was getting away with it. Jacob, I'm so sorry. Please, we can fix this. We can... But Jacob shook his head slowly. Fix this? There's nothing left to fix. You destroyed everything. His voice was eerily calm, almost peaceful, as if the decision had already been made long ago. He no longer felt the sharp, jagged edges of betrayal cutting him open. He had been bleeding for weeks, but now, standing here, it felt like the wound was finally beginning to close. I loved you, Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. But you've turned that love into something dark. I can't go back to how it was. Mia shook her head, her hands outstretched as if trying to reach for the man she had once loved. No, Jacob, I still love you. I do. Please. Jacob leveled the gun at her, silencing her mid-sentence. His finger rested gently on the trigger, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. He stared into her eyes, the woman he had once loved more than anything, now reduced to a desperate, broken version of herself. Her lips quivered as she held her breath, waiting for the inevitable. But Jacob didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he lowered the gun. The silence that followed was deafening. Mia didn't move, too scared to even breathe. She watched him in disbelief, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Jacob just stood there, staring at her, his face unreadable. What are you doing? Mia whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. Jacob took a slow, measured breath. You're not worth the bullet. He dropped the gun to the floor with a soft thud, the weight of it gone from his hand but still heavy in the room. Without another word, Jacob turned and walked out of the bedroom, leaving Mia sobbing on the bed, surrounded by the wreckage of what used to be their life together. Jacob walked through the hallway in a daze. The house that had once been a home now felt like a hollow shell, each room echoing the memories of a life that no longer existed. He could still hear Mia's sobs faintly in the background, but they were like distant thunder rolling far behind him as he moved toward the front door. He didn't bother grabbing anything. No keys, no wallet, nothing. He just needed to leave. The house, this place, had become suffocating. Every inch of it was tainted by her betrayal, haunted by the ghosts of their shattered marriage. He couldn't stay here anymore, not with the weight of everything that had happened. The night air hit him like a slap when he stepped outside, cool and sharp against his skin. He didn't feel relief, though. Not yet. The tension in his chest had yet to loosen. His legs carried him down the street, aimless, his mind still racing with the image of Mia's face as he left her behind. That face, once beautiful to him, now twisted into something ugly, something unfamiliar. Jacob had no destination in mind. He just needed to get away from the house, from the carnage he'd left behind. His footsteps echoed on the pavement, steady and deliberate. But inside, his thoughts were a chaotic storm. The further he walked, the more he realized something had changed within him. He had thought revenge would give him closure, that watching Mia's world crumble would somehow heal the wounds she had inflicted. But now, after everything, all he felt was empty. Daniel was dead. Mia was broken. But none of it filled the void. The anger that had once driven him was gone, leaving only a hollow ache in its place. He had become something else in the process of seeking revenge. Something darker. Something he couldn't undo. The man he had been before, the quiet, patient Jacob, was gone, replaced by a version of himself he didn't recognize. Eventually, he found himself at a park, the same park he and Mia used to visit when their love was still new and untainted. He sat on the same bench where they had once shared lazy afternoons, laughing, dreaming about the future. The irony of it all struck him like a cruel joke. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the distance, trying to make sense of what had happened. The world around him moved on. Cars passed, people walked their dogs, life continued. But Jacob was stuck, suspended in a moment that would forever define him. He had imagined this ending so many times in his mind, but now that it was real, it wasn't the triumph he thought it would be. There was no satisfaction in his revenge, no closure, just an aching emptiness that stretched out before him like an endless road. Jacob didn't know what came next. He didn't know how to move forward from here, or if he even wanted to. But as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer the man he used to be, and he never would be again.